Guten Abend, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich im Namen des Deutschen Zentrums für Integrations- und Migrationsforschung zu unserer zweiten Lecture Series, diesmal mit dem übergeordneten Thema Rassismusforschung, Methodik und Ethik. Die Lecture Series findet im Rahmen des Nationalen Diskriminierungs- und Rassismusmonitor statt, kurz NADIRA. Mein Name ist Gian Sinanolo, ich leite die Geschäftsstelle des NADIRA seit 2020. Kurz zum Hintergrund des Nationalen Diskriminierungs- und Rassismusmonitors. Der Deutsche Bundestag hat vor dem Hintergrund der rassistischen und antisemitischen Anschläge in Halle und Hanau und in den internationalen Protesten nach der Tötung von George Floyd das DeZIM im Jahr 2020 damit beauftragt, einen nationalen Diskriminierungs- und Rassismusmonitor aufzusetzen. Auch die neue Bundesregierung hat die Verstetigung des nationalen Diskriminierungs- und Rassismusmonitors im Koalitionsvertrag festgeschrieben. Das Phänomen Rassismus soll hier in seiner Breite, unter anderem in seiner individuellen, institutionellen und strukturellen Dimension sowie für unterschiedliche potenziell von Rassismus betroffene Gruppen untersucht werden. Die theoretischen und empirischen Analysen werden dabei von folgenden übergeordneten Fragen geleitet: Welches Ausmaß hat Rassismus für Deutschland? Welche Ursachen liegen Rassismus zugrunde? Welche Folgen hat Rassismus für die Gesellschaft? Hiervor werden sehr unterschiedliche Perspektiven, empirische Zugänge und Methoden gewählt. Dazu zählen unter anderem quantitative und qualitative Befragungen von Allgemeinbevölkerung und von potenziell betroffenen Gruppen, aber auch experimentelle Methoden, Dokumenten- und Medienanalysen sowie Analysen von Rechtsfragen und Beratungsdaten. Ziel dieser Lecture Series ist es, die disziplinären Forschungszugänge auf den Untersuchungsgegenstand Rassismus vor dem Hintergrund ihres jeweiligen Kanons von Methodologie und Theoriebezügen in den Mittelpunkt zu stellen. Die Erforschung von Rassismus unterliegt wissenschaftsethischen Herausforderungen, um Prozesse der Rassifizierung durch Kategorisierung und Markierung nicht zu reproduzieren und zugleich diejenigen, die von Rassismus betroffen sind, zu schützen. Rassismus unterliegt einer Geschichte der Verplausibilisierung und Legitimation durch Wissenschaft. Ich erinnere hier an die Rassenanthropologie, Eugenik und Rasseforschung, die es weiterhin kritisch aufzuarbeiten und ethisch zu bewerten gilt. Gerade vor diesem historischen Hintergrund und einer gesellschaftlichen Verantwortung als Forschende wollen wir dieser Frage der Methodik und Ethik gemeinsam betrachten und mit Ihnen gemeinsam diskutieren. Die Lecture Series dient dazu, diese disziplinären und methodische Vielfalt vorzustellen und hier in einen Zusammenhang von methodologischer und theoretischer Kohärenz mit Blick auf den Untersuchungsgegenstand zu nehmen und natürlich in Hinblick auf seine Potenziale und Limitationen herauszuarbeiten, insbesondere für eine Wissenschaft, die dazu beitragt, Rassismus abzubauen. Die Lecture Series richtet sich dabei an Studierende, WissenschaftlerInnen und die interessierte Öffentlichkeit, und es werden jetzt weitere Termine im Juli, September und Oktober folgen. Jetzt begrüße ich endlich unsere namhaften Gäste ganz herzlich, die den heutigen Termin zur Rassismusforschung in der Wirtschaftswissenschaft bestreiten werden. Professor Komlos wird einen Input zum Thema Hidden Systemic Racism in Economic Theory geben. Professor Ooma wird kommentieren und Dr. Seiko Keta wird moderieren. Ganz kurz zu Seiko Keta. Seiko Keta hat Wirtschaftswissenschaften mit Schwerpunkt Entwicklungsökonomie an der Universität Clermont studiert und dort 2016 zu dem Thema internationale Arbeitsmigration promoviert. Von Januar 2017 bis April 2018 arbeitete er für die Organisation Innovations for Poverty Action in Burkina Faso an einem Feldforschungsprojekt. Seit Mai 2018 ist er als wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter im Forschungsbereich Migration, Integration und internationale Arbeitsmarktforschung am IAB tätig. Sein Forschungsinteresse liegen auf dem Gebiet der internationalen Migration sowie im Bereich der Arbeitsmarktintegration von Migranten und Flüchtlingen. Er befasst sich zudem mit Entwicklungsökonomie mit den Schwerpunkten Bildung und Funktion der Sprache. Ich freue mich sehr auf den Austausch mit Ihnen allen. Jetzt geht es auf Englisch weiter und ich übergebe das Wort an Sie, Seiko Keta. Weiter, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank, Dr. Sinanoglu, für die schönen Worte. So, ich werde jetzt auf Englisch übergehen. So, welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce today's lecture on hidden systemic racism in economic theory. As an economist myself, I find it frustrating to observe how little economics has contributed to the understanding of causes and consequences and mechanisms of racism and racial discrimination compared to other social sciences. The most used analytical frameworks are more than 50 years old. Since then, racial discrimination has been considered a minor topic, with theoretical advances receiving little attention. Empirical work on discrimination has increased recently, but mostly using the same analytical framework to test oversimplified theories. This leaves most important questions unanswered. For example, can we really treat racism as a unique phenomenon? To what extent is racism inherited from slavery, as is most prevalent in the US, different from racism inherited from colonialism, for example, as is most prevalent in Europe? The state of affairs also raises ethical questions. Can a social science such as economics afford to ignore realities of a substantial fraction of the world population? While it is easy for me to criticize the lack of commitment of economics to the analysis of racism, it takes much more to exactly point out the shortcomings of standard analytical frameworks used in economics. In today's lecture, we have the pleasure of welcoming two distinguished speakers who have a lot to say about these topics. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor John Komlos and Professor Stefan Umer. Professor John Komlos is Professor Emeritus of Economics and Economics History at the University of Munich and has taught at other institutions including Harvard University, Duke University, University of North Carolina, and University of Vienna. He holds 2 PhDs, one in history and one in economics, both from the University of Chicago. Professor Komlos has devoted most of his academic career developing and expanding the field of anthropometric history, which culminated in his founding of the field of economics and human biology with the journal of the same name in 2003. Following the trauma of the 2008 recession, Professor Komlos started teaching and writing about the need for a paradigm switch in economics. He has published several influential books, including Principles of Economics for a Post-Meltdown World in 2016, and Foundations of Real-World Economics, What Every Economic Student Needs to Know, the second edition of which was published in 2019. This is the second edition of an important book that addresses widely used gaps widely used in Economics 101 textbooks. Today, Professor Komlos will discuss the need for a paradigm shift in economics to take racism and racial discrimination more seriously. Our second speaker is Professor Stefan Umer, who received his PhD from the Goethe University of Frankfurt and currently holds the chair of economic geography at the Department of Geography at the University of Bayreuth. His research interests lie in the economic geography of globalization and development, drawing primarily on insights from heterodox economics, political ecology, and post- and decolonial work. His current research focuses on topics related to globalization, such as the political economy of ecology, the global supply chains and financialization of land and agriculture, and the digital transformation of labor. The results of his research have been published in leading journals of economic geography and are widely cited. Professor Umer has research experience in both the global South, West Africa and East Africa, and the global North, specifically Germany and New Zealand, which gives him a unique perspective on geographically uneven development processes. Recently, he has written on the role of racial discrimination in economics and offered interesting thoughts on how economics could take race and racism more seriously in an effort to engage with lived realities. And we are looking forward to hear his thought on these questions today. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Komlos for the main presentation, followed by Professor Uma, and then we will have about 1 hour of discussion with the audience. So the floor is yours, Professor Komlos.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, even though the topic is not particularly pleasant. I'm talking about racism in mainstream economics. I'm not talking about the economists themselves. I'm not saying that the people who do economics are racist. It's just the way the system works and the way the theory works to reinforce this disadvantages of those who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So I'm not saying that there is an intent to be racist. Some intent is something that is rather difficult to figure out, right? So maybe we have racism without racist. The point is, and I'm mostly focusing on the United States, but every country has disadvantaged groups. The system disadvantages those people who are descendants of slaves or the indigenous people, Hispanics. We talk about institutional racism. We talk about structural, systemic, or even colorblind racism. Okay, it's just the way the system works, because it's kind of odd if you ask yourself 150 years after emancipation, 57 years after the Civil Rights Act in the United States that outlawed discrimination, there must be some reason why the descendants of slaves are still at the bottom of the totem pole. Okay, and there are two possibilities. Either they are in fact inferior, or somehow the system is biased against it. And you can look at a lot of psychological literature, but there's no evidence that they are inherently inferior. So the conclusion is that there's bias in the system against them. And here, John Rawls is very important in my thinking, and I urge you to look into him more deeply. I can just mention it here. Skin color is a genetic endowment. Okay, I didn't do anything for my skin color, just the way I was born. And John Rawls calls this the genetic lottery. Some people are born with some color, others with other color. And that's a matter of luck. And luck cannot be the basis of a just society. It's a very simple philosophical position. Luck cannot be the basis of a just society. Hence, we should design the society, structure the society in such a way behind the veil of ignorance that such luck doesn't play a role. The veil of ignorance means, how would you design the society if you started from scratch? Okay. You certainly wouldn't start it out by saying that people of some color is going to be more privileged than other colors. You wouldn't do it that way, because you would be afraid that you would be disadvantaged when you realize what your skin color is. Obviously, from scratch means that you don't know what your color is to begin with. You don't know anything about yourself. You don't know whether you're smart or not smart or this or that, your gender, whatever. Okay, so you're designing the society from scratch, and that's an important idea. So most of us wouldn't want to be dropped into this economy at random. Let's face it, because we are risk averse, and we would have our reservations. If we happen to end up in the South Bronx, it wouldn't be very pleasant. So basically, the idea is that the economy as currently constituted is not just, okay? Another argument is that the system, the socio-economic system as it now functions, is basically biased toward the status quo. And economic theory supports the current economic system. And therefore, economic theory provides the ideological background that supports the status quo. And the system is biased against the poor because it's very, very difficult, especially in the United States, if you're born on the wrong side of town, it's very difficult to work your way out of that kind of a neighborhood. And minorities are disproportionately poor. And therefore, it follows, in my way of thinking, that mainstream economic theory is biased against minorities. And you can see that blacks are 1.8 times as likely to be poor than their share of the population, whereas whites are 0.7 times as likely to be poor. So there's got to be some mechanism, okay, that brings that about. And, you can look at the income distribution and you'll see that African Americans are bunched up at the lower end of the income distribution. You can see how much more African Americans are in this low end of the distribution, which doesn't make sense from a justice framework. Why is it that African Americans should be at the low end of the totem pole? That's what I call the low end of the totem pole. And in a just society, there wouldn't be any difference. That's what we should be aiming for. The idea is that the attributes that provide advantages in a free society, a free market society, are inherited to a considerable degree. And that's what I mean by one generation inherits the previous generation's attributes, and that includes education, that includes all sorts of advantages in the society, income, wealth, and so forth. As you can see, the median net worth of whites is much higher in the upper middle class range. Here we're talking about people who are from the 60th to 80th percentile. You see that the median net worth among whites is about $250,000, whereas for blacks, it's $50,000. And we're talking about the upper middle class here. This is the middle class. You can hardly see it. Here's the lower middle class. You don't see that either. And here are the poor. They're in the negative. You don't see them either. So this kind of gives you an idea of the disadvantages. Life expectancy at birth of African Americans is almost 3 years less than that of whites, and that's before the COVID epidemic. But mainstream economics doesn't talk about this. You can look at all the textbooks. There are no indications of any of this that I've been telling you, okay? In fact, major figures in the field disregard this issue. This person gave a speech, for example. He's one of the big shots, Marty Feldstein. He was one of the big shots. He passed away since then, and he talked about full employment. Well, at the time of full employment, it was very, very far away for African Americans. The unemployment rate was 16% at the time, and usually African American unemployment rate is about twice that of whites. That is also something that you can really have to look for to find out. Okay, here's the true unemployment rate up to 2020. This is usually called U6. This is not the official unemployment rate that makes it into the headline figures, but it's the true rate as measured, if it were measured correctly. And you can see that the rate is about twice that. Even before COVID, African Americans had an unemployment rate about 12%. Okay. And these guys, these mainstream guys, are thinking that this is full employment. Okay. Of course, those without a high school diploma are even at a greater disadvantage, 32% unemployed. Now you know why people like George Floyd or Eric Garner get into trouble for a $20 bill. Okay, George got killed for $20, and of course their imprisonment rate is very high as well. So I'm going to next turn to what is it about mainstream economics? What are the Achilles heels of real markets that are disregarded by mainstream economics? And I'm going to mention a few of them here. And the first one is power. Power doesn't exist in most textbooks or in most economics classes, but power is very important because power is what influences the political system. Okay, the power is the ability to control the action or thought of others, and translates directly into power, economic power, political power. And I just showed you how much more wealth the whites have. And obviously, they're going to design a system that works to their benefit. So the concentration of income and wealth is a problem. And mainstream economics is neutral about the distribution of income, which is a very big problem, because there needs to be a countervailing power to offset the power of big corporations. Obviously, the power is skewed in the favor of those who are already privileged. And the poor are obviously not well represented in Congress. And that's why the minimum wage in the United States is still at $7.25. It's not indexed to the inflation. In 1968, it was $11.80. Okay, so that goes to show you how little power poor people have. This is the real minimum wage, and as you can see, under Reagan, it dropped by about 30%. Absolutely ridiculous. Occasionally they raise it, but then inflation takes it away. You know, it's a ridiculous system. Well, there's all sorts of other problems with drug prices in the United States, which are monopoly prices. The Congress did not allow government to negotiate with pharmaceuticals about drug prices, so poor people have to pay monopoly prices. Obviously, that's going to be a big problem for them. And the wealthy also spend an immense amount of money to influence the dominant ideology that free markets are beneficial and benefit everybody. Well, of course, it's not true, but they keep on emphasizing that and spend an incredible amount of money in order to accentuate that ideology. The top 1% of households earn about 1/5 of total income, while there is an incredible deprivation at the bottom. The bottom half of the society has this sliver of the wealth of the nation. They have absolutely no skin in the game. The top 1% has about a third, as you can see in 2019, and that has even grown during COVID. Well, Tim Cook is 625 million. I ask you whether it's worth that. I doubt it. Okay, so power is a big issue. Information is not taken into consideration in most of economics. In some subgroups, they begin to talk about information, but it's not in the main focus, whereas information is extremely important, because markets that have incomplete information is inefficient. It's as simple as that. And most markets have incomplete information. And this is especially hits poor people worse because they don't have the money to spend on information. Okay? So information is a very key issue, and it's costly. And this puts poor people at a great disadvantage. It's a much bigger share of their income. Okay? And of course, advertisers spend a lot of money to scramble information and confuse people. And that puts minorities at a humongous disadvantage. Okay, so disregarding the cost of acquiring information is a very big issue. I can give you some examples, but I think it's pretty obvious. And mainstream economics begins with adults, okay? But most of us were not born as adults. And that makes a very big difference because we entered the economy as babies. So that the economy has a very long time. The markets have a very long time to influence our unconscious, to influence and condition us to think in certain ways. Okay. So our thinking is part of the economic system. That's what I mean by being endogenous. It's part of the economic system. And mainstream economics doesn't want to deal with that. Okay. Because this developmental process is very important once we become an adult, because markets urge a spendthrift personality. They urge instant gratification. It was not our choice to become an instant gratification society. And the children internalize the social norms, and advertisements have a very large effect on our unconscious mind, everybody's unconscious mind. But poor people especially have not enough wherewithal to withstand that kind of a advertisement pressure. They have they might be a single parent household. The mother is working 2 jobs. Very difficult to supervise what the children are watching on television. So that Pavlovian conditioning becomes particularly important for poor people. And these mega corporations can have an immense influence on children and youth. And they do not urge them to be prudent consumers, to do their homework, and prepare them for college. And of course, junk food advertisements are prevalent, and that's how the obesity epidemic spread. So basically, we have producers influencing our wants and influencing children until adulthood. And I call that Pavlovian conditioning. And that makes it much more difficult to grow up to be a prudent consumer. A mainstream assumes that people are rational. If people are rational, you don't have to worry about all this because you're using your prefrontal cortex and you know everything. So consumer sovereignty is king. But they forget about Freud. All this is pre-Freudian. Okay, because we are not always rational, let's face it. There's a lot of emotional aspect to our actions. And in fact, Daniel Kahneman, please read his work, says rationality is impossible with finite minds. Our mind is not perfect, okay? And that's a very big problem. 4 people actually got Nobel Prizes for proving that people are not rational. And yet mainstream economics starts with the idea that people are rational. There's no emotion, no need for judgment, and so on and so forth. So actually crazy. And mainstream economics is also pre-Pavlovian. They don't take into consideration the conditioning that human beings are subject to. So we should talk about bounded rationality. And bounded rationality doesn't exist in mainstream economics except in some nook and crannies hidden from students and from the public. And of course, we have big advertisement firms in Madison Avenue. Hollywood does a lot of conditioning. Silicon Valley, with its tech giants, does a lot of conditioning. And poor children are particularly vulnerable. Okay. And of course, there are opportunists, bad actors. This also is not given proper attention in economics. And opportunistic behavior means that people take advantage of poor people, especially because they don't have the proper information. They don't have the education to understand the nuances of the English language. And that makes them all the more vulnerable to unscrupulous people. Society has a big influence on our lives, and that is also absent in mainstream economics, where they focus on methodological individualism, which means you focus on the individual, but the individual is embedded in the society, but they don't consider the society. It's absolutely crazy. And it's especially bad for poor people because they don't have the networks to really understand the opportunities that are available to them. They don't have the role models, and the culture of poverty perpetuates itself. And of course, that gives the privilege an opening to look down upon poor people as free riders, and people are making the wrong decision. Look at what they're doing. They're making the wrong decisions. Well, yes, but they did not have the opportunity to develop. That's why the first 20 years of life is so important. That's why the schooling is so important, and they're mostly deprived of good schools. They are in mediocre schools. They're provided with mediocre schools, and of course that perpetuates the problem. Basic needs does not exist in basic economics, believe it or not. You can look at all the textbooks. There's no such a thing as a basic needs. But of course, for poor people, that's a very big part of their income. So, disregarding that is problematic. morals. There are no morals in economics. Okay, so I started out by talking about justice. There's no such a concept in economics, but justice to me is as important as efficiency. Morality is as important to me as anything else. So if you neglecting that, you got a discipline that is pretty problematic. And the mainstream delegates morality to markets. Well, let the markets do it. Well, that's not a rigorous way of social science because they're disregarding all the Achilles heels of markets. Markets are not morally neutral instruments for defining the common good. That's important. Let markets do it. Why? Why markets do it? Why? Okay. So that we should impose our morality on markets is not an easy thing to do. Obviously, we're human beings and our minds are limitations, sure, but we should not be delegating morality to markets. That's a big, big principle that economics overlooks, okay? Well, mainstream economics treats discrimination as benign. Discrimination hurts the discriminator because they're going to have to pay a higher price for labor. If they don't hire the African Americans, they're going to have to hire whites, and they're going to pay a higher price. So they're going to be put out of. They're going to be at a disadvantage in the marketplace, and this theory goes back to Gary Becker, who wrote his dissertation in the twilight of what in America is called the Jim Crow era. Very, very bad, racist. He wasn't racist, maybe, but what he said was pretty terrible in hindsight. It makes discrimination appear legitimate. You can discriminate. That's up to you. You're a free person, right? Well, not really, So I call this really Alice in Wonderland economics, which means that it's a kind of a fairy tale, like a grim fairy tale. Perfect competition is most of the thinking in mainstream economics, in the public media and politics. Most people think in terms of perfect competition. What is perfect competition? Well, it's the shoe repair store or the bakery in your local village, or a butcher, small time operations. Okay, but that's immaterial in today's economy. You got to talk about the big time, okay? And the big time is oligopoly and monopoly. So that should be the default model, okay? Perfect competition is anachronistic. It's a negligible share of the economy, and it just misleads. It misleads. And that's why you have all sorts of lobbying against unions. You have all sorts of lobbying against raising the minimum wage. And of course, that means that poor people do not have the power to come back at the power of the oligopolists and monopolists. Exploitation, of course, doesn't exist in mainstream economics, because if you're a rational person, you know your own self-interest, your best interest, you're going to act on it. And that's the end of the story. Okay. But if you're a poor person, you don't have the power, you don't have the information, you don't have the education, and you're up against the monopolies and oligopolies, obviously you're going to be taken advantage of. And that's a very big problem, especially for poor people. And even in the COVID pandemic, we saw that poor people, mostly of color, were at a disadvantage and perished at a much higher rate than those who had the economic ability to stay at home. So in the mainstream, consumer protection is superfluous, basically, because it doesn't have any, doesn't serve any purpose. But that gives an opportunity for opportunists, for predatory lending, to take advantage of poor people, fast food industry, all sorts of exploitation of asymmetric information and lack of countervailing power. Okay. Space is absent, except in economic geography. We'll hear about that in a moment. But if you can look at the textbooks, there's no space in there. Okay. But the truth of the matter is that the poor are concentrated and mostly segregated, and they don't get adequate schooling. They don't have adequate services. And every American city has such neighborhoods. Okay. And it's very difficult to grow up in such a neighborhood because you don't have the role models, you don't have the education, you don't have the support system that children need in order to grow up to be successful members of the free society. Time is not of the essence, which means it plays a very minor role in economics. But there's pad dependence, which is a big keyword, pad dependence, which means that many processes are irreversible. Time only moves in one direction. Okay, you can't move the time back. Let's think about that. So a person who grows up in a slum district without adequate schooling is going to have a very difficult time once that person becomes an adult. Okay, so disregarding that, you got a problem. Role of government is trivialized, okay, by the mainstream. Government, we don't need government, right? Well, the government plays a crucial role in the economy, and especially for minorities, not only because they structure the institutions, not only because they do not link the minimum wage to the inflation rate and all sorts of other reasons. It's also the government's role to maintain the balance of power in the economy. That's forgotten. Okay, the balance of power in the economy, only the government can do it. Okay. Relative incomes matter a lot, especially for poor people who see the rich and famous living very wealthy lives. It becomes very difficult for them for self-control. Relative income doesn't exist in mainstream economics. Okay, and it's an incentive for the poor to break the law and get into difficulties, unfortunately. Comparative advantage, is another big problem. Globalization, international trade is supposedly good for everybody. Well, it's not really, it's not bad for the winners, right? But there are also losers, and it's well known for economists that there are going to be losers, people who are less skilled, less educated, who have to compete with Asian labor with a much lower wage. And that's well known, but it was kept secret mostly, and people didn't pay attention to it. But of course, it devastated, and the globalization devastated industries, devastated the poor, devastated the less skilled, and led to an epidemic of deaths of despair, which means that about 100,000 people commit suicide in the United States every single year, and it's growing every single year because they don't have anything to do. They don't have a main way to, the market doesn't provide for them. So delegating morality to the markets means that these folks, the only way out for them is to reach for the gun or for the epidemic needle or for the alcoholic bottle. Okay, so hyperglobalization was a real problem in the United States and even led to fascist movements. Okay, because downward social mobility is very, very hard to accept. Very hard to accept. Okay, so these are 16 ways in which economics, mainstream economics, fosters systemic racism, fosters the disadvantages of minorities, especially who are at the bottom of the totem pole. Okay, and helps people who are already privileged. Well, I see that I'm out of time. We can cover some of these issues when we come back to the discussion, but basically mainstream economics paints a picture of nirvana, and we're far away from nirvana. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Komlos, for this very eye-opening talk. And of course, I mean, this is a very broad topic and we will have time for discussion. So for the audience, you can send your questions to the email address rassismusmonitoring@DeZIM-Institut.de. And now I will give the floor to Professor Uhuma for a comment on this first talk. And after this, we will have time for discussion. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keita. Do you hear me? Good. Hi. Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Great. Yeah, thanks to the organizers for this amazing setup, the series in general. Yeah, looking forward to many other interventions in this on this platform. It's really an honor to appear after Professor John Komlos. I've read quite a bit of his work, the more recent work, because I'm not an economic historian. And I even incorporated one of your talks about 2 weeks ago on the economic history of the rise of Trump in my class, and students responded very well to that presentation you held at Duke about 2 years ago. I fully agree with your basic arguments, which were A, the socio-economic system is biased towards the status quo. Of course, we could ask where exactly, so geography is a little bit missing, but I would say this applies to what I call transatlantic societies and their offsprings. So New Zealand, Australia would be part of this as well. And economic theory supports the current economic system, and therefore it supports the status quo. So I just try to requalify these large basic arguments a little bit more, and then zoom in also on the Achilles heels you've mentioned. And I'm trying to square this with some of my own recent work on race and racism and economics. I also think it was really good that you highlighted that there is a strong autocorrelation between different types of attributes that we usually use to explain uneven social mobility, social inequality more generally. So behind divergences in human capital, wedges, etc., there is often race and racism that is an underlying cause, and then it reinforces the whole system. Let me maybe start with this notion of Achilles heels, because some of the listeners may not be familiar with this. I stumbled across this notion when I first read your paper, which has a brilliant title, I think, that was published a few years ago in the Journal of Black Political Economy, and it was called Why African American Economists Should Abandon Econ 101, so basic introductory theories to economics as soon as possible. I think these Achilles heels are very well chosen, and they clearly show what is wrong with so-called mainstream economic theory, which is basically variations of neoclassical economics. And I also appreciate the design ambition behind the talk. Now, if we had to condense those Achilles heels a little bit more, I would single out the following one. One is a disregard for power in mainstream economics. Oligopoles, monopolies, etc., technically have their space, but often they are practically irrelevant, I would say. And of course, power is more than corporate power. And I think you flagged this a little bit, but it could have been more explicitly. There is institutional and there is interpersonal power. Second, economics is not just oblivious of history, path dependency, as you called it, and other economic historians are calling it, and economic geographers. One could also add it's also oblivious of its own history and of its own racialized history, and how it has contributed to the racialization of the economy, I would say, in even more global terms. The third is the closed off rational individual is the base of everything, methodological individualism paired with a utilitarian worldview. The fourth, individuals enter transactions in an undifferentiated and free manner. The fifth, there's no relationality, nor is there a system. And I think it's really worthwhile to cite here a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that just came out in 2020. You also cited in your works, Spicer and Lang, on the economics of discrimination. If you search that paper, there's not a single entry on power. If you search for system, it is only usually mentioned in the context of the criminal justice system, and it's very hard, I would say, even for mainstream economics, to maintain that image that something is that everything is okay in the criminal justice system in the United States. So it's worthwhile reading out their closing paragraph, their final paragraph in this paper. This idea of discrimination as a system is not easy for economists to address. In the previous sentence, they said we need to engage with it more. Developing truly general equilibrium models is difficult, especially when the endogenous variables go beyond prices and quantities. Empirical microeconomists, the primary group of economists who study discrimination, have in recent years placed a heavy emphasis on credible identification, which means basically invested a lot of effort in establishing causal relationships between different variables. However, that's the last sentence of the paper. The idea of discrimination as a system does suggest some different angles for research and policy analysis are needed than just doing natural experiments or certain types of more sophisticated regression analysis. So they acknowledge that probably it's worthwhile looking more into sociology and anthropology, but it really only comes at the very end of this paper. And this relates to the next point you also made, the separation between value reflected in market prices, because much of economics focuses only on market value, and values, the moral fabric. So we end up with this disembedded economy. The next one, aspatiality. Geography matters to many social phenomena, including, of course, privilege, access, remuneration, despair, physical security, poverty, etc., etc. And then I would add a final point that was absent in both of your writings that I read. I would add what is really missing is capitalism. I mean, you can search Menkew's introductory text to economics. I think capitalism is mentioned a very few times, and I would bet that even many economics colleagues, if I would really push them to define capitalism as a socio-economic systems, and that is experience with the students I'm having from economics, they really struggle to come up with, let's say, 10 characteristics of capitalism, not just 3, free markets, private property, and competition, for instance. A perspective that takes capitalism seriously as a historically grown socio-economic, and I would even say socio-ecological system, would zoom in onto the following 4 questions: who does what, who owns what, who gets what, and what is done with the surplus. And racialized and gendered unevenness about the underlying phenomena would really, be something to reckon with as well. So there's a geography to those questions. So now, after this brief appreciation and a little condensation of what Professor Komlos just has said, I want to move on to how this squares with my own humble writings on race and economics. It's a kind of outsider writing because I've been, for a long time, I've been mainly interested from a social studies of knowledge perspective in what goes on in economics. But I've started research projects with economists on economic discrimination in the venture capital space. And more recently, I do more substantial work on it, including empirical work. So I wrote a little bit about it and asked myself, not, moving a little bit beyond the stage of problem analysis, the Achilles heels, and move on to the question, how would economics have to change if it took race, racialization, racism, and probably also, gendered inequalities seriously? And I flagged 10 points. Some build a good bridge to Professor Komlos' work, others may be new. First, I argued a reconfigured economics has to account for history in much deeper ways beyond Eurocentric writings of history. Second, connected to this, economics needs to acknowledge its own origin story. Certain powerful strands of economics not only display a colonial tendency and have even been proud of it, but they themselves are characterized by a deep coloniality whereby key thinkers in classical and modern economics had and still have relations to imperial and colonial projects. And these projects are often highly, very, very deeply about, establishing and maintaining inequalities. Third, a reconfigured economics would have to combat the fallacy of being a positive science, as Friedman called it in the 50s, offering a neutral and objective take on the economy that operates beyond vested interests and ideology. You may know this from, German debates. Sometimes if you speak with mainstream economists and produce an argument that is, let's say, more critical in systemic terms, they would say this is an ideological reasoning, hiding their own ideological positioning when they produce a counter argument. Fourth, it needs to transcend methodological individualism and acknowledge power-saturated structures and relations to which the economy is made and lived. Fifth, a reconfigured economics would need to bring in intersectionality, other categories that most economists have also problem with, like aged differences, gender differences, class differences, and how they intersect as categories: race, gender, age, class, age, disability, as categories in the lived realities of the economy. So this is really about complicating your analysis of inequality. Sixth, it needs to be pluralist in methods. Race, gender, and other social complexities can only effectively be approached when multiple methods are accepted as legitimate tools of knowledge production. I think the craze for mathematics needs to partly give way and partly be complemented by real-world economics that talks to people and also accepts small n as a base for making claims about economic affairs. You can talk to only 20 people and make very, very meaningful statements about the economy. I remind you of Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his theory of the firm, which was based on work in the 30s. And this was all qualitative type of work. He just visited firms across the US and, developed a very deep understanding of how firms make decisions. Seventh, it needs to look inwards, and I think Professor Komlos neglected that a little bit, and question its own social demographic makeup at various levels, editorial boards of journals, but I would also add its internal structure of racial and gender discrimination, and especially the toxic professional bro culture buttressing the field, which makes it very, very hard for minorities, including women, which of course are not a demographic minority, on the contrary, but they are a minority in the field of economics. Very difficult to enter this field and be reminded that, other min subjects, math heavy, sometimes more math heavy as mathematics, have performed much better in increasing the representation of women. So it cannot just be about mathematics scares away certain people, but it has to do something with the more general culture of the field. Eighth, the reconfigured economics has to abandon the so-called Parsons Pact, which is a term by sociologist David Stark from Columbia University, which was basically about the division between economics and other social sciences. So Stark says in the 1930s, neoclassical economics, was around, but not the dominant economic script of the time. Parsons and other economists decided that, with the continuous professionalization of their fields, a certain type of division of labor would be good. So sociology ended up in doing society, structures, systems, and economics ended up doing the economy, dealing from everything structural, moral, etc. So this, in a way, provided a very fertile ground for the cementation of neoclassical economics and its variants, even though other competing programs back then were still in place, like Keynes' teachings or the older German institutionalism, Veblen, and some of these ideas. Ninth, the reconfigured economics needs to acknowledge that certain policy recipes based on mainstream economic advice have often done little to no good to racialized minorities in many white majority countries, but also to many people in former colonies. And finally, it needs some humility, should abandon this God's eye view that many economists so readily perform. Race and racism can only be tackled if much of the field moves beyond its monodisciplinary arrogance, as another economist recently called it. So I think the viewers here can see a little bit where this recent piece of mine that I wrote for Development Economics blog, where it met, what Professor Komlos has said, and where it maybe departed a little bit or put the emphasis on something new. Now, I would like to move on in the last part to some of omissions I've seen in Professor Komlos' presentations, and I think it's just a matter of debate to bring them to the surface a little bit more. You mentioned at the very beginning that, talking about racism in economics is not about turning economists into racists. And I would be interested in how this squares with the assertion of your colleagues in stratification economics, like William Darity or Derek Hamilton, who assert that dominant groups try to maintain their position in the hierarchy. Their first assertion, one of their most powerful assertion, is that assets, wealth is transferred from generation to generation, but on highly unequal terms. And they would then move on and say that those who benefit from this highly uneven reproduction of wealth, they also have a real material interest in maintaining that hierarchy. Black legal scholars from the US, like Cheryl Harris, have also maintained that we should arrive at a notion of whiteness as property, where people actively invest in the category that, you know, is partly shaping social mobility, being part of the circle of the so-called white majority. And they sometimes ruthlessly defend that kind of property as real property. There is no examination of how key categories of economics have racial origins or perpetuate racialized inequalities like property, competition, rules over cooperation, for instance. Why don't we hear more about cooperation, which is an important principle at large for you know, many actors in the economy, but often minorities? Cooperation plays a huge role, and I would say one could learn a lot about other forms of transacting. Just a second, my daughter needs to go to the toilet, so take a quick breath and then we soon finish. So to all mainstream economists out there, this is care work, mostly done by women still, and it's important. You should deal more with it. Good. Efficiency, productivity. John Locke, a key figure in liberal economic thought, basically justified, you know, colonization, that land moves to the most productive actor, and is a very important figure, historical figure in the evolution of liberal thought that also fused modern economics. There's no note on methodology in the paper we wrote and the presentation we saw. My question would be, how does a particular quantitative framing of economics maintain the status quo? Whom does it exclude? The whole culture of being the smartest, whom does it exclude? The kind of application of mathematics, maybe not, you know, for the purpose that would attract then more minorities to study economics, but often for more kind of prestige type of effort that is reinforcing the system. The demographics of the discipline, I quickly flagged them. The relationship to neighboring disciplines. Does economics not just need to become more sociological, but don't we have to transcend these boundaries when we really meaningfully want to study racial disparities? And what place does white supremacy more generally have in your thinking, because it didn't pop up? Maybe a last note on terminology. I probably would always remind people that we don't deal with slaves, because it reifies the objectification of Black women, men, and children. And I would always remind people that these were enslaved men, women, and children. To close here, I would have some personal question for our main speaker. You taught in Germany, in Munich. How would you transfer your talk and what you said to the context here in Germany. Anything to adjust for? What explains your rather recent turn to these topics? You were trained in Chicago under prominent economic historians of slavery, Robert Vogel, who even won a Nobel Prize. That history, how does it shape your current take on this subject? How do you place stratification economics that was really pioneered by Black economists in the US in shaping your own more recent thinking about race and economics and the race economy? And maybe also, what do you make of recent calls for reparations for past injustices that are led by Hilary Beckles in the Caribbean? He's from Barbados, and William Daradian, Black economist from the United States. And maybe lastly, if Lawrence Summers would sit in the audience, what would he respond to your talk? Maybe we should not end this talk with Lawrence Summers, but I've seen him sitting in some talks and become very hostile to the presenters. And I wondered if someone with your stature would be there, what would you respond? Not the junior economist, but someone like you. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Umar, for this nice comment and adding a lot of additional points, and also highlighting some of the key points raised by Professor Komlos. So this gives us a lot of inputs for a lively discussion, I hope. So a reminder to the audience, you can send your questions by email. And in the meantime, I will give the floor back to Professor Komlos to respond to the comments by Professor Umar. And there were some direct questions and also some more indirect attributions. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. There was a lot there. I'm not sure where to begin. Yes, I went to the University of Chicago, but I somehow escaped being conditioned, socialized into believing the mainstream ideology, because I was a little bit older by the time I got there. I think that is a key issue, and I realized from the very beginning that what they're saying doesn't really add up, because the University of Chicago is in the middle of a slum, and all you have to do is look out the window of the big lecture hall and realize that these people are not maximizing their utility the way it's described on the blackboard. And I also lived in various systems. I lived in under communism, and I came to the United States as an immigrant. So I experienced the capitalism. You wanted to mention capitalism. I experienced capitalism from the bottom up, and it was a very tough system. You have to experience it to believe it. And I think that is one of the reasons why I have as much empathy toward the people at the bottom as I do, because I experienced a kind of slavery. I'll call it a slavery, because when you're working for a minimum wage, as my father had to do, when we came to this country, it's a very, very tough life. And so that, I think, helped me to see the world in a broader context. What else? The privilege, you brought up William Darity and the idea that the privileged want to defend their privileges, and that's that's pretty obvious, but that doesn't make them racist, in my view. because they believe that they deserve their privilege, just as many of the French aristocrats of the 18th century believed that they deserved their privilege. And it's hard to find people like myself who would say, no, I don't deserve my privilege, and my privilege was that I had good parents, and that's a privilege. And the society provided for my education. I didn't provide that for myself. So that's the social input. And I was born with higher than average IQ. I didn't do anything for that either. So I don't deserve that either. Okay, but there are very few people who are going to admit that. And instead, like Lawrence Summers, will I argue that I worked hard, and I deserve what I have. But from a Rawlsian perspective, and that's why I emphasize the Rawlsian perspective, it's an old different ideology. And the idea is that we don't deserve it. We don't deserve, because it's a matter of luck. I happen to have a genetic endowment that helped me get through school, and my parents told me what to do, and I had a role model, and that's my life, and that's why I'm not so critical of capitalism per se, because I believe that there can be a capitalism with a human face, like there is in Denmark and Finland and Norway and Switzerland, even, who can create happy people. That is, to me, the key. If you can create people who are satisfied with their lives and live happily ever after. And I think the Norway does a pretty good job of it, even though they're capitalists. So I think that is the way capitalism is structured in many countries, especially in the United States, where the economy is run hot. I call it, the economy is run at full throttle. And when the economy is running full throttle, you just kind of run over people who are disadvantaged. So, that would be my response about Rawls' capitalism and the University of Chicago and people like Lawrence Summers, who says, well, we have a consistent discipline. And I think he would argue that it's good enough. I heard many lectures from him, and one he said, well, look at all our millionaires who are in their 20s. Well, yeah, some people make it like that, but that's not, in my view, what is the essence of our society. The essence is that there are a whole bunch of people at the bottom who are squeezed until they are drowning in a sense, or are drowning. Maybe that's the way to put it. And I think that is not my way of running the economy. You also brought up the idea of reparations, and I'm fully in favor of reparations. I think that it should take the form of pulling everybody into the middle class. A $23 trillion economy like the U.S. economy should not have poverty anymore. Poverty should be eliminated. So we have to eliminate all the slums. We have to have good schools, like the best schools in the world. We have to follow in the footsteps of Finland, which has such good schools. And that would be my way of paying for the sins of the past. So I answered some of your questions anyways. But let's open up for discussion and see what the audience has to say.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Komlos, for these elaborating on these points. So we have some questions from the audience. The first question, I think it's for Professor Komlos. It comes back to your point on capitalism. You mentioned capitalism with a human face, example, European Nordic countries. And the question is whether a world without racism is possible in a capitalistic world. So I read it as it comes, and
well, of course, I think it. I think it is. I think it is because, as far as I can tell, the Scandinavian countries are pretty open societies, and it's a matter of education. It's a matter of education. And if the schools are structured and the families are teaching the children that skin color, let's call it skin color, doesn't make any difference, then I think it can become the standard model. But it would take some work, obviously, and it is not going to be easy given the history that we just heard of the human race. It's not only capitalism. Feudalism wasn't much better. Socialism wasn't much better. The gypsies were mistreated in Romania in the communist era. So Germany has a lot of problems with that. Also, you asked me what my view is on Germany, and I think they also have a problem, not as much as in the United States, but it's under the surface. The big point is roles. Your skin color is a genetic endowment, and if people emphasize that, then there's no reason to discriminate or have an economy and society that discriminates on the basis of skin color. It's pretty ridiculous, really. But a lot of ridiculous things are handed down from generation to generation, and that's what we have to argue against.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. So there's another question for Professor Uma. What are the differences between Germany and the US from your perspective when looking at racism in research in economics?
Yeah, thank you. It's probably also a question where Professor Komlos can jump in.
Yes.
If there's time, I can take up a part of the first question again, because I have a different view on this. But I mean, one basic difference is, of course, that in the United States, you have so-called minority group economists who study racial and other forms of discrimination and have spearheaded innovative methods. Elora Derreno-Cord, Derek Hamilton, William Darity, these are the kinds of people to look for, and our economics profession in Germany is even more homogeneous than that of the United States. So this obviously shapes what kinds of topics may be put on the radar in the very first place. there may be research on racism I'm not familiar with, but nothing has really ever jumped into my face beyond maybe people studying labor markets and studying discrimination in labor markets in Germany. But this is a very detached type of research that normally does never build, a firm bridge to debates on structural racism and debates that are also, been held in other parts of the world, and then you just try to connect things a little bit more systematically. I can't really say more than that. The institutional context, of course, differs extremely. Redlining is a good example. In Germany, we don't have to talk about redlining as an institutional practice that really shapes where certain resources flow or how elections are being conducted, because our system works differently. But of course, you could deploy certain views and instruments and theories that have been developed in studying labor markets and social mobility and the role of human capital amongst many other types of variables, including race and gender, in shaping these type of outcomes that could be fairly easily transferred to Germany, I would say. So maybe Professor Komlos wants to say a little bit more, because you know both contexts quite well.
Well, in the United States, the idea of freedom is a little bit more accentuated. Freedom has a very different connotation in the European context, because I think that it's always taken in freedom within a social system, or social constraint is taken into consideration much more than in the United States, where individual freedom is taken to an extreme limit to imply that it is my right to discriminate, or it's my right to have a statue of a Confederate soldier on the campus, which is taken as a symbol of freedom, and that makes a big difference, because methodological individualism is accentuated on account of this perception of freedom, which does not take the social implications quite as seriously as it should.
Okay, thank you very much. So we don't have many more questions from the audience, so I would take the opportunity to ask some questions myself, because there are so many inputs that I don't know where to start. But my first question would be, so from both your talks, I am a bit puzzled whether economics needs more theory or less theory, or maybe a different theory.
The right theory.
Exactly.
It's not more or less, but it's got to begin with the right theory.
Yes, I want just to elaborate on the question. So we have a lot of so in economics there's a recent trend towards more empirical analysis, and as Professor Uma mentioned, these partial identification strategies that are focused on causality and that neglect the general equilibrium. And yes,
in order to do empirical work the right way, you have to have some theoretical background, the right theoretical background. If you come to the data with wrong assumptions, which is most of the time, most cases,
yes,
it doesn't do much good.
Exactly. So that's exactly the point. So there's so much evidence now on the discrimination and how race matters in school, starting in preschool, in housing, in the labor market. You mentioned the wealth inequalities, which are mostly inherited from historical measures, starting from slavery. So all this evidence is there, and economists know about it, but we still have
economists don't know about it. The economists don't know about it because they disregard these issues.
Exactly.
You know, it's much easier to disregard these issues than to face them square on, because then they don't have anything.
Exactly.
They have to start from the beginning.
Yes, I agree with that. But the question is, like, how do you go from there to developing some, I don't know, more like you said, right theories, because you have several options. You could go more in the direction of making much more complex models, or
no, complex models ain't gonna do it. You gotta begin at the beginning. Okay, the beginning is at birth. If you disregard the children, you have adult economics and you forget it. It's not very complex. It's not complexity. You need to begin at the beginning. What happens to the child once that child is born in the economy? If the economists disregard the first 20 years of life, how are they going to come up with the right ideas? You see what I mean?
Yes, of course.
So economists have been wrong on every single major issue in our lifetime. Economists said the financial crisis was impossible, and it happened. Economists said that deregulation is good for us, and it blew up in our face. Economists said that globalization is going to help Americans, and it brought us Trumpism. Where were economists right? Where it mattered?
Professor, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I may want to add to that, because if you follow this line of making the models and the methods better, more sophisticated, randomized control trials would be one of those examples which recently won the Nobel Prize. It's really worth asking in how far these methods actually contribute to the reproduction of the racist system, because they are highly...
What have they brought us? What have they brought us?
First, I would say, what did they bring us? China developed without having randomized control trials, let's put it very bluntly. But also this assumption, that you make tests on certain type of groups of people without fully informing them what goes on. Also this type of armada of research assistants that are never mentioned in papers that actually execute those studies on the ground. Again, a kind of racialized division of labor. Only the top economists at the top then get the benefits. These are just two examples where I would say better methods, more experiments actually do not solve the underlying problem. And I think the causality revolution in economics has to some extent been quite dangerous, because it suggests that we are on the safe side now. And it crowds out research that cannot establish the same kind of causality. There may be other notions of causality, including dialectics, but they don't matter in that kind of intellectual space.
Exactly. Trumpism was there's no causality experiments that can be done on what brought about Trumpism. You have to look at it in its historical development, path-dependent development from Reaganomics. You know, you have to look at a 40-year period. Economists are not good at looking at such 40-year periods.
Yes, that's also well known that economists rarely learn from other social sciences. I think you both raised this point, which is, I think, also acknowledged in general, except maybe by economists. Yeah, so I have another question for Professor Komlos, and I hope that Professor Umar will also have something to add. So I see two levels of readings from your 16 Achilles heels. So it focuses mostly on Econ 101, which is the first course that undergraduates receive, and most cohorts end with this course and go out in politics and business and just have this idea of I don't know, perfect competition and all this stuff. And then there's also the graduate level with professors who know about the limitations of these models, but still we don't see a lot of emphasis on racial questions and racism in economics in general, at both levels. So I wanted to ask you, like, how do you distinguish between these two levels of analysis, and where would the priorities be from your point of view to change economics approach to racism?
Well, economics creates a new species called Homo economicus. And economics is really about this species. It's not about human beings. So, you know, obviously, Homo economicus doesn't have gender, doesn't have race, doesn't have IQ. You know, none of these applies to this theoretical construct. And that's a big problem. So in the first instance, I would say that economics has to be about human beings. Forget about Homo economicus, because it doesn't exist and never existed. And that to me is probably the very first step. And of course, my lecture is not only about Econ 101. I just use that as an example, because you take the BWL students in Germany, the business students, they usually take 1 year of economics also, and then they go out in the business world and operate on the wrong assumptions. And most of the undergraduate work in economics is very. My lecture pertains to most of undergraduate economics, where information there is not really put at center stage. Information is the key to economic performance. And where is it that that students learn about the importance of information? Maybe in graduate school, but maybe even not there. So it's a very, very big problem, and has an incredible impact on racism also, because, as I tried to accentuate, if poor people are deprived of education, they are not going to be in a key position to make the right decisions in key junctures of their lives. And then that gives an opportunity for the privileged people to look down on poor people who are not making optimal decisions for themselves. So information is incredibly important. Power is never mentioned in undergraduate, well, even in graduate school. Power is just not existent. Did any of you learn about power in economics? I didn't. I went through graduate school and I had to figure this out myself. I didn't learn anything about power or the importance of power, the way institutions are structured. The institutions are structured in such a way as to entrap poor people. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Professor Hammer, you want to add?
Sorry, I mean, sometimes I'm reminding of waiting for Godot, because this is often a defense strategy of our colleagues in economics, that they would brush off critique by saying, be more patient, it will reappear.
We'll learn it later. We'll learn it later.
Exactly.
But it never comes. That's a Godot is a tremendous good point.
And in your view, has it to do with the demographics in economics? Because economics is also well known for being very imbalanced in terms of both race and gender, and so there are two sides to this. I think from your writings, I learned, Professor Komlos, that first the first touch with economics that, for example, Black students in the US receive tells them that this has nothing to do with their daily problems, which doesn't induce them, to pursue a career in economics, which would maintain, the social homogeneity. So could you say some words on the demographics aspects of the profession?
Well, Homo economicus, as I said, is a theoretical construct, and it's not emotional. So it's not going to appeal to females who are looking for the human element. It's a very mechanical type of education, and it's going to select people who are going to think about economics as a mechanical engineering occupation. So there's a selection process that has demographic components, but the main issue is in terms of a mindset. I noticed that when I went from history to economics, and it was an entirely different set of folks. Entirely different set from the very beginning.
Yeah, maybe to add something here. I mean, incentive structures, let's use a mainstream terminology, I think explain part of the problem as well.
Yeah, of course.
Not just the interest of the dominant group to reproduce themselves, be it consciously, be it less consciously. But they will tell you will not get published with this type of research in the major journals that matter. Economics is the only discipline amongst the social sciences where something like a star is existing, the star economist, which it tells you something about the reputational and mechanisms in the discipline and the gratification mechanisms in the discipline. And at least the story goes that it's so easy to tamper with, to spoil your own career prospects once you don't play by the rules, right? So I think this is also part of the story.
Definitely.
Yes, for sure. I mean, you mean that if I understand correctly, the fact also that the top economics journals are so heavily based in a few institutions gives also a lot of power, which brings us back to this question of power. Yes. To a few
and the incentives, that's a good concept in this regard, because the incentives are such as to reproduce the discipline as it is. And the major journals will not publish contrary opinions or contrary perspectives. Look at my publications. Two major publications were in Germany, not in the United States. The one on racism was in Germany, and one on Trumpism was on Germany, and one on Reaganomics was published in Germany. Okay, so the German journals were more open, but obviously it's they don't have the impact as they do in the main major journals of the United States.
So we have a question from the audience. The idea that the history of slavery shapes U.S. society is very much established by now. How about the role of European colonialism for current economic systems?
Go ahead, I'll leave that to you.
Well, I mean, it's, European colonialism is a kind of relative term because the US are a product of European colonialism. So it does not make sense to fully detach what goes on and has been going on in the so-called New World, in the upper part of it, North America, from the rest of the territories that were affected by colonialism. And I think John Locke's theory of property is a very, very good example in this regard, because it had a huge influence on notions of the evolution of notions of property in the United States, or later United States, but it also had a huge influence, on how this has developed in other parts of the British Empire. I think there's more and more work that shows how economic thought has a deep coloniality at its core, and that really takes a longue durée perspective, including the place of the environment in this story. Something I think we haven't really talked much about, but there is work which clearly shows that the expansion of European colonialism was buttressed by certain type of theories that again then allowed for the construction of certain types of system where cheap labor, but also cheap nature basically was re-imported to the center and fueled wealth accumulation in the center. And this is a process that continues until today. We would have a problem if everyone became middle class, right? Because the planet can't sustain it. So currently the advantage is that much of the planet is excluded from that type of lifestyle. So there is a racial element to that form of society. But the solution, I think, would I mean, in moral terms, it's really good to improve the lives of people, but it cannot be done in a globalized way at the upper American middle class or German middle class type of level, because the resources are not there. So I think those connections are more and more being debated. But interestingly, I don't think they bounce back into economics. It's really, other disciplines which think about this and provide new intellectual histories of economics and what influence it had in a longue durée on shaping the planet, basically.
Yes, thanks a lot. So we have a very long question from Dr. Howard Stein, professor from the Department of Afro-American and African Studies of the University of Michigan. So it starts by noticing that economics has notoriously low numbers of Black people, both in key economic positions and in the profession as a whole. For example, only 5% of the economic staff at the Federal Reserve are Black. They also have a well-documented problem with misogyny. The first Black female was nominated to the Federal Reserve last month for the first time in history. So how much does the reality of the profession and their lack of critical introspection influence their view on discrimination? So that's the first point. There are two more, but I think I will let you answer the first, and then I will ask the second two.
Well, as I said earlier, I think that economics selects people who are not very introspective about the nature of the economy and the society. Homo economicus is not going to attract a lot of people who have suffered discrimination of one sort or another. And I think that's one of the reasons why African Americans have been repelled by the economics profession. And the way the economics profession has pressed discrimination to an epiphenomenon is one of the reasons why I wouldn't have studied economics if I had come across such nonsense ideas. But I think that's a key issue.
Okay, thanks. And the second point speaks to your criticism about Gary Becker. So he writes, I think Professor Komlas lets the economics profession off the hook by suggesting that it is really not deliberate, but just an issue of neglect and supporting the status quo. However, people like Gary Becker argue that it is perfectly acceptable because discrimination is simply a utility maximization decision. So I think this speaks back to one of your points, the points you raised.
Right. I mean, we can argue about it, whether, that's intentional racism or just an offshoot product of the way people think about a particular topic. I cannot prove my point, and I don't think that we can look into Gary Becker's brain and pick it out and look for intentions. I don't have a good answer for it. It's just my intuition. My intuition says that these guys really believed in what they were arguing. They believed in what they were arguing rather than creating an argument for their racist ideology. But I can't prove that. It's my intuition. What do you think?
Professor Omar, you want to add something on this question of intention defending the status quo versus explicit racism?
Yeah, I think I'm appreciative of Professor Stein's point. I think it's probably, as it was presented, it was too easy a kind of letting of the hook. But you're of course right. We can't look into the mind of Becker and some of these other pioneers of neoclassical take on discrimination. At the same time, there are studies about job talks when minorities, especially women, give job talks. This is a recent study in economics where they had access to all the protocols from these meetings, and they for instance found that women would be more frequently interrupted than men. They investigated other platforms in economics, like job market platforms, where there was rampant sexism, misogyny, etc., etc. So from this kind of studies, of course, you can assume that when people are discriminating, it is also about intention and maintaining the status quo intentionally. And I have my own experiences from certain institutional setting where I could see this live, how it works when those on the mainstream side would really try to crowd out the non-mainstream in a very, very intentional way. So I think I would read more intention into my explanation than I've heard from Professor Komlos. But he has a point. We can't look into the mind of Gary Becker. So
yes, of course. But I would
in the end, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, of course.
It doesn't matter, right? It's bad. You know,
yes.
we can say it's bad, and it shouldn't be taught. It shouldn't be taught. It shouldn't be in the textbooks. You know, but it's still there, unfortunately.
Okay, and as a last point, Dr. Stein would like to hear more about the ideas, how to go forward, and also how this relates to tools of institutional economics.
This Professor Komlos, not me.
Well, of course, institutional economics is very important because it looks at how institutions structures the economy and our lives. And what I've been arguing is that power relations are very important in that. And where do we go from here? Well, you know, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of here overnight. Let's face it. Okay, so it's a long process of trying to talk sense into people. Is the way I look at it. We have to publish. We have to convince people that the system ain't working for half of the population in the United States. It's not only minorities. Half the population, usually on polls, say that they're not doing well, and
okay,
and it's going to take a long time to get us back on track. But it's worthwhile. It's a path-dependent process. That's one thing we have to keep in mind. But it's a path-dependent process. And the point is to get on the right path. And the right path is to change people's minds. And that's what I'm trying to do. And that's what you guys are trying to do. And that's the only thing we can do.
Okay, I think that's a great spot to stop the lecture now, changing people's minds. And we
I
had
hope I succeed a little bit.
Yes, we had a lot of food for thought, and we could go on for a long time. Thanks a lot to both of you for very inspiring talks, and thanks to the audience for the questions. And I will give back the floor to Dr. Sinanoglu. And I thank all of you for being there and following this lecture with us. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for being a good moderator and a good commentator.
Thanks a lot.
Great.
So, ich möchte mich an dieser Stelle bedanken bei Professor Komlos, bei Professor Ohmer und bei Dr. Keter für diese wirklich spannende Diskussion. Wir werden jetzt im Juli, August, September uns unterschiedliche Disziplinen vornehmen, wie die Geschichtswissenschaften, die Medizinwissenschaften, die Philosophie, die Soziologie und dort gucken, wie Rassismus konzeptionalisiert wird, untersucht wird. Sie können das alles nachgucken und sich informieren auf unserer Homepage rassismusmonitor.de. Ich möchte an dieser Stelle mich auch nochmal ganz ausdrücklich bei Dr. Kimiko bedanken und bei Dr. H., die maßgeblich an der Konzeptionalisierung dieser Lecture Series beteiligt waren. Wir freuen uns, wenn Sie das nächste Mal wieder dabei sind und wünschen Ihnen noch einen schönen Abend. Tschüss.